So thanks everyone for being here. It's a fun thing for me on Sunday mornings to be able to connect with you. I appreciate you taking the time to be here. So I want to talk this morning about, I suppose the overall theme would be the importance of being an individual. And seems kind of mundane, but I don't think it is that we're all freedom fighters, and what we're fighting is for the freedom to be ourselves, or you know, my little phrase, just be you. And I don't underestimate how challenging that is. That's why I talk about, we're freedom fighters, because it seems to me that everywhere people are happy to uh, take away your freedom if you're willing to give it. And this is true emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, uh, politically, socially. And maybe there's no more important sort of vocation or than being a freedom fighter. Um, the challenge is that when we talk about being an individual, we're in the midst of a kind of there's a kind of a cultural bias these days for a community, and I get that. But I want to just show today how there can be no authentic community and no genuine community without the participation of courageous individuals. Otherwise, the community becomes a cult. The community becomes the crowd. The community becomes uh, sort of followers. But of course, that's not genuine community. And I think it starts with the courage to be yourself. Um, Brian Swim, who's a physicist and cosmologist, and who informed a lot of the books that I wrote previously in another life, talked about evolution as being comprised of three fundamental dynamics. One is subjectivity, in the interiority of all beings, because if consciousness is primary and we don't live in a material universe that can be reduced to matter, then every being, whether so-called inanimate or animate, enjoys interiority. This is what gives life ultimately meaning, I think, because if nobody enjoyed interiority, nothing would actually matter. The other two dynamics are differentiation and communion. And differentiation is what makes it possible for there to be distinct beings, that we differentiate into a trillion different kinds of creatures. And then communion. But if there was only differentiation, we would experience tremendous alienation and isolation, because there would be no connection. There would be no communion. And so it turns out that communion is the other dynamic, where individuals come together. One of the ways of putting this is there's an evolutionary sort of phrasing that the many become one and are increased by one. The many become one, so that there's an amalgamation of many, but there's also an increase of one. And so that's a community of individuals. But if you take our bodies, for example, we are comprised of like millions, trillion, billions of differentiated little beings, all of which do their own thing as individuals. For example, in our gut, there's, I've heard like a million or trillion, billion different kinds of bacteria, but they remain bacteria, just as each of our differentiated cells remain differentiated. But in this communion event, this concentrated amalgam of the human being, of you, of your body, it's all working together. So the many become one body, but are increased by one, and that increase is you and me. So in this way, and we become subjective creatures with interiority, concentrated amalgams of the many, but because everyone's doing their job and being what they're meant to be, there's also an increase of one, which is you and me and this body and your body. And that's how the evolutionary process works. Wholes become parts of larger wholes, but part is actual and the whole is actual. The many become one and are increased by one. And in fact, when the evolutionary process breaks down, say in a cancer cell, where the differentiated being refuses to be part of a communion event and goes off and starts doing its own thing and eventually destroys itself because it refuses to participate in the communion. So that there's lots of good sort of examples going on in our world at the human level as well. And this all breaks down either when individuals refuse to be individuals for whatever reasons, or the communion event doesn't issue in the increase of one, which is the individual, which is an expression of the larger community, but an authentic expression, therefore an authentic individual. So you take a movie like, or there's a series on Apple called Pluribus, which, you know, I'm waiting with bated breath for the third year of this, but it's basically a story. Vince Gilligan wrote it and directs some of the episodes. And it's about, you know, Earth gets invaded by a virus from aliens. And what happens is that the virus takes over and creates a very pleasant reality for everybody, but everyone now is one mind. Everyone shares the same mind. So there is incredible unity, but there's only one mind, except for in one person. Well, there's actually 10 of them, but the protagonist in the series, for some reason, the virus doesn't take. She's immune to it, and she sees what's going on. And she over time, we see the horror, the actual horror, despite the fact that everyone is happy, the horror of the absence of individuality. It's kind of a bit of a nightmare, and it is for her. She sees what's happening and realizes that her mission is to be the freedom fighter, to restore humanity. So these people are individuals again. And I think this is what it's a play on what can happen socially and politically if we're invaded by the virus, say, for example, of totalitarianism or fascism, where unity is forced upon individuals through threat of violence, where there's a union between the state and the corporations. There's no distinction. And eventually through violence in fascism, there's no freedom. There's a loss of individuality. But it's also true in communist states, communist countries, or at least the deficient expression of communism. I don't think it works personally. Whether that's Marxism or indeed beyond that, you know, you get into truly Orwellian dimensions with this in 1984, where the totalitarian state uses methods to extinguish individuality. And the protagonist in that, what's his name? Does anyone remember what his name is? It slips. Anyways, he's the one guy, maybe there are two, who fight for his freedom. Of course, the reason that 1984 is so stark and is kind of a genre of horror, I would say, is that he's powerless to change this, that the individual is eliminated, basically. And I think that there are modern day impulses towards this totalitarianism. But the thing is, with mass media, the internet, various kinds of control, it's not even, it happens through propaganda. It happens uh, through different forms of capture. It happens through social movements that uh, that individuals stop thinking for themselves, stop speaking up, which is the ultimate defense against the totalitarian impulse in the human being. I think we're experiencing that the tendency, the impulse towards totalitarianism now. But it's much more subtle. It's not being enforced through capitalism. It's being enforced through memes. It's very subtle, so that it's bypassed even the resistance of individuals until you wake up to what's going on. So, see, that's what's at stake, actually. I call it end people pleasing, right? But this larger thing is at stake. It's this sort of the disappearance of the individual into the whole, where the many become one, but it stops there. There's no increase of one, which is the natural evolutionary process. And the conceit, I think, of totalitarian and fascist regimes is that we don't need there to be an increase of one. We don't need individuals. We're happy for an elite to establish a status quo and just leave it at there, where the elite get wealthier and more powerful, and the rest are just batteries in service of the one big machine. So just to reiterate, that's the big picture of end people pleasing. It's like we're trying to affirm and celebrate the individual, so that the nightmare scenario of 1984, which in some ways we're living through now, I think, is my hunch, doesn't occur. Obviously, just at the micro level of our own lives, to live with more freedom and to just be you is also, the foundation of any kind of joy or true happiness. But then you can expand it out from there. So what is it to be an individual in community then? I've shared with some of you about some kind of experiments that I was part of, me and my friends were part of. You go away for a weekend, I've done this a couple times, and it's a gathering of 6 or 7 people who are deeply committed to being themselves and also want to know what that looks like in the context of community. And so there's this so-called we space technology. And the we space technology is you sit around a circle, you light a candle, you may put some kind of mantra or philosophical teaching in the center, you read it out loud, and then you ask people just to reflect and then offer their reflections. And then you experience the evolution of the teaching in and through the individuals reflecting on it. But the key here is that the moment any of those participating individuals come from ego, the whole thing collapses and you can feel it. If they come from wanting to show how smart they are, for example, it collapses. If they start talking about the books they've read, it collapses. If they're trying to be intelligent, it collapses. So everyone is under the mandate to be truly themselves and to share only, does this need to be said? Does this need to be said now? Is what's coming through fresh? In other words, is it emergent? if I've had this thought before, or if I've written a book about it, or I've read, like, I'm not going to share it. I'm going to let something that's authentically coming up, a curiosity, wondering, and imagining, I'm going to offer it to the circle. And then what happens is that there's a thread that starts building on that. And then there's an emergence of a kind of fresh wisdom. Almost you're enveloped by this third presence that includes all the individuals, but is greater than the sum of the parts. You know, when Jesus talked about when two or three are gathered in my name, there am I in the midst. And one of the ways of imagining Jesus is the presence of Sophia, or wisdom. So a kind of sacred wisdom emerges that's not born of the brain. It's not born of the mind, which always can only process stuff from the past. It's coming from a fresh field of information that people, by being committed to what they are, what's coming to them in a fresh way, and speaking it and sharing it within the safety of the group, something. So, and in this context, the many have become one, but there's an increase of one, and the increase of one is the we that's born of individuals sharing this communal space. So it's a beautiful thing to witness. It's also very interesting to witness what happens when somebody breaks it by coming from ego, by trying to prove themselves, justify themselves. If there's any remnant of not feeling legitimate, it brings a whole, you feel it in the room. It's like, oh, it's just off. Yeah, it's this. So that's an experience of what I would call an evolutionary dynamic, where subjectivity, interiority, plus differentiation, plus communion come together and produce something genuinely new. The increase of one, an increase in intelligence, which is not the intelligence of the ego or the intelligence of the brain or this mind. It's an intelligence that we participate in a larger sense, in the largest sense. So now, just to bring this full circle, when we're caught in the adaptive strategy of people pleasing, it becomes almost impossible to participate in our own evolution and the evolution of our species, to put it at a ground level, because that, what I'm talking about here now, needs the authentic expression of you to show up. That's, I would contend, one's purpose, is to express yourselves throughout the course of your life. That kind of authentic expression can be understood as the purpose of our life, because then the big intelligence, the big heart, localized as you, gets to know itself as you. And then there's this information feedback loop that keeps the whole thing evolving. And I also contend that I would put parenting as a high vocation here, because it's the place with the potential to produce individuals, to think for themselves, to reason, to challenge, to become media literate, to debate, to question authority. And that would be one of the primary tasks of family. But unfortunately, what happens in a lot of families, because of intergenerational trauma, families are producing people who learn to conform and adapt for survival reasons. And so we're not actually producing citizens that can actually, free citizens who can participate in a democratic, so the democracy becomes authentic. We're producing citizens who are susceptible to what the authorities want them to believe, what the dominant worldview is, even if it doesn't resonate with the soul, with the heart. And this dominant worldview is pervasive in and through, what Jesus just called the world, the kingdom of Caesar. It's just because that world, that kingdom has a different agenda, and it's domination through violence, or through domination through propaganda. It does not need individuals. It does not want individuals. It punishes individuals, which is also a reenactment of what happened to many of us growing up in the family, where our expressions of individuality were humiliated or punished, or we learned that we couldn't speak up without danger to our very being. So, this is what's at stake. This is the high level view of why I'm encouraging people. I'm giving the remaining days that I have to nurturing and creating space for freedom fighters, to emerge. I'm just going to stop.